The seventh point I want to mention is learn to speak on your feet. Oh, I'm sure that many of you are looking and saying, boy, isn't he lucky. He gets up there and he just rattles those words off. He can just get those poems going. I wrote a poem about my wife. I didn't know what to give her on Christmas just a couple of years ago. We've never been out with anyone else in our whole lives together. We've been married 32 years. And when we were young, she had long hair, and when we were married, she had long hair. And so I didn't know what to give her for Christmas, and I wrote a little poem, and it's just called Rubina, and it has birds flying through it, and it says, Rubina, I have a girl called Rubina, 'twas love at sight when I seen her, with long braided hair and complexion so fair, with a posture that made me more keener. And now she is my true wife, and we're vowed together for life. With 2 sons and a daughter, we've done what we oughta, all because of love at first sight. And I'm sure that many of you think, well, how does he do that? How does he speak on his feet like this? Let me tell you that I read what Abraham Lincoln said. He said, I will study, I will prepare, and my opportunity will come. And so I practiced public speaking every morning for 5 years, and nobody ever asked me to speak. I'd set a goal to be a public speaker, but suddenly they brought something to our city. It was a nude stage review. It was a pornographic play. I came home from church one day and I said to my wife, it's about time the men of this country started to stand up for the women folk rather than treat them as sexual objects, that we are all equal in the sight of God. And she said, what are you going to do about it? And I was able, with others, to take this to the Supreme Court, and for the first time in 600 years in an English court, won an action against immorality. 12,000 people march in one place and 36,000 march in another. And I was on every talk show, in every newspaper. I was the best equipped guy in town because I had prepared and my opportunity had come. I did 213 debates in that year and won every single one of them. And I know that you're thinking, but how did he overcome the nervousness? Or didn't he have any? Well, I read what a team of market researchers found out interviewing 3,000 people. Their greatest fear was speaking before a group that received a rating of 41% alongside of death at 19. And if I was to speak here some years ago, I would wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning with nerves, and I'd probably run a mile at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and then maybe at 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock with nerves. And then with that nervous energy gone, I would then run backwards and forwards to the bathroom, and you know what that means. A half an hour before I got to stand up before you, Rubina would get a glass, big glass, and half fill it with milk. She would put in 3 tablespoons of flour, 3 spoons of sugar. She would mix that up into a clag, and I would glug, glug, glug that down so I wouldn't have an accent when I stood up before you. Then when I got home, I'd take 4 chocolate laxettes to get everything back to normal again. So don't tell me you can't do it. Rubina used to get upset. She used to be so concerned because I had to do this. In the middle of summer, they used to put a hot radiator behind me to stop my knees from wobbling. I always used to have something strong to hang on to so that I wouldn't shake it too much. But you see, if you face your fear, in time your fear will flee from you. Learn to speak on your feet. You'll reach more people. I was overawed one time when I spoke to 40 million people via satellite television, and the tens of thousands and millions that I'm able to speak to around the world today is because God gave me the want to face my fears. Also, we need to look at emotion. Very often in business or personal relationships, we allow emotion to override all reason. Aristotle Onassis, during the oil embargo, he said, I made one great mistake with dealing with the Arabs. He said, I never thought in our world of business emotion could override all business reason. And some of you may be salespeople and you may use emotion to open the door, but logic will slam it shut very quickly if you don't follow through with logic. And some of you that may have more emotion than others may find themselves at times getting emotional about situations, and when they get emotional, they're unable to handle a situation. You can handle it if you understand one very simple thing, and that emotion is not always subject to reason, but it is always subject to action, and action is the key word. And ladies, if you have a problem getting emotional about something and you really want to handle it, get out that vacuum cleaner. Men, get out that lawnmower. Get involved in some physical action that will allow you to control that which you want to control. Number 9 is criticism. Well, I mentioned to you about that nude stage review, and the headlines read, St. Peter in his fight against the devil. The Grand Wowzer strikes again. The battle-scarred champion of a dozen crusades wins yet another round in pornography. And all of these things were in the newspapers and the comics in our country on television were making cracks about me all the time. And my friends would come around and they'd say, we're so concerned about all this criticism you're receiving. And we just want to protect you and we want to help you. And I said, well, there's no problem. I'm fine. They said, but this criticism, it would crush us. And I told them what I'm telling you. And that is, while you're tossing and turning in bed of a night, mulling over the thoughts of the things that were said about you, while you're trying to work out what they meant by what they said, remember that criticism has no power of its own. The only power that criticism has is that which you give it. It has no authority of its own. It has no power. The only power that criticism has is that which you give it. I like what Mark Twain said about criticism. He said if there's any real power in criticism, the skunk would have been extinct years ago. There is something else called the law of attraction. Birds of a feather do flock together. If you want the scientific term for that, orthodontical species of identical plumage tend to congregate in the closest proximity. But birds of a feather do flock together. Do you attract or repel? Your inner feelings are reflected finally by your outer actions. Your appearance. I know many God-fearing people say God looks upon the heart. He's the only one that does. He's the only one that can. And he's the only one that will. You don't get a second chance on a first impression. If I was to come up here this morning and talk about success and have 4 days growth on my face, wear a pair of old sandals with dirty toenails sticking through, have some baggy pants, an old shirt with the elbow out of it and some worry beads around my neck, I don't think the law of attraction would be working for me as I was standing up here trying to talk to you about success. But how many of you do not use the law of attraction? Clothes do not make the man. But boy, they sure do introduce him. And so many of us, we get around sloppy. And within that we lose the dignity and the self-esteem that God has given us. Do you attract or repel? Your personality, your voice, is it warm? Are you confident? Does it smile? How long has it been since you put one of those little connections onto your telephone and listen to the way you talk on the telephone to detect whether or not you're smiling when you're talking to people? This is the real thing. This is not a dress rehearsal. You're not coming back for another shot. And your product, whatever you're involved with, whatever you work at, do you believe in it? Do you show it? Do you demonstrate it by producing the people that have been pleased to buy it from you or be involved in it with you? You see, this is not a dress rehearsal. This is the real thing. This is the final event. We need the law of attraction. Number 11, persistence. I wish you could know a friend of mine called George Peake. George is worth 600 million. George was not always like that. I said to him once, George, what happened? There was a change in your life. Something happened to you that created this change. Would you mind sharing it with me? He said, well, I was flying over Sugar Mountain and the aeroplane got caught in a downdraft and we had engine trouble and we crashed and we were hooked up on a tree in Sugar Mountain. He said, I was dazed, but as I came to, I looked at the pilot. His leg was broken. He said, and I could smell smoke, and I grabbed him and I pulled him and we both fell out of the tree and I broke my legs. He said, but I managed to drag him away and myself away, and we lay on our back, and suddenly the plane exploded and burnt the two of us. He's badly scarred today. I said, did that make the difference, George? He said, it sure did. He said, I looked up to heaven. I said, Lord, you got my attention. What do you want me to do? And he found some land in Georgia, $3 million. He didn't have $3 million. He had enough money to put a holding deposit on it for 1 year, and enough money to do a feasibility study, enough money to do projections and some sketches. And he went along to the bank to get $3 million, and he walked in there with a certain amount of confidence and razzmatazz, and he gave the presentation to the bank manager. He showed him the flow chart. He showed him the feasibility study. He showed him the perspectives and so on. And as excited as he can be, he went through the whole program, then asked the bank for $3 million, and guess what they said? No. Now, God bless bank managers, but by jingoes, I bet that guy is kicking himself to this day. George went to the next bank manager, and it's not so easy to do it the second time round. And he said no. Then he went to the next bank manager, and he said no. And the next, and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. George went to 97 banks. At the 98th bank, nearing the end of 12 months, George Peake got his $3 million. George today is worth $600 million. That is called, ladies and gentlemen, persistence. But what do we say as we go to do something and we get a little bit of opposition? We say, God has closed the door. Kick it down. God does not close doors on his people. You know, so often we use that as an excuse that, well, there's a lot of trouble around here. God may not be in it. As I understand it, if God's in it, all hell breaks loose. I think of Josiah Wedgwood. As you go into your beautiful stores and you see that beautiful Wedgwood there, it's magnificent. How did it happen? How did one man, everybody was making pottery in England in those days, but how did one man step out of the crowd? Well, he went along to the father of this beautiful English maiden. She was blonde and blue-eyed, and she had a figure like an hourglass, and she was beautiful and delicate and feminine. He was built like a gorilla. He had a big nose with a blister on the end of it. And he went along to this girl's father, and he asked for her hand in marriage, and the father took one look at him and thought, gorilla? And he didn't want this fragile Stradivarius being put in the hands of a gorilla. And so he questioned the young man, and he said, young man, you don't have any prospects. And he thought of a way of putting him off. He said, if you can prove to me you have some prospects, then come back to me and I will give you the hand of my daughter in marriage. They were both broken-hearted. And he said, sir, what do I need to do? He said, you come back with £1 million. He said, and then I'll allow you to marry my daughter. 10 years later, Josiah Wedgwood knocked on the door. He had a battered suitcase. He laid it before the father, and there was £1 million there. By this time, the father had had another 10 years to put up with his daughter. He looked at the man and said to him, I don't want your £1 million. I just want to be sure you had the persistence and the guts to handle my daughter. We have a man in Australia called Sir Bruce Small. Sir Bruce Small, I was on the board of directors with him. He was almost like a father to me. And single-handedly, he built Surfers Paradise, a whole city. And I said to him, but Sir Bruce, at one time in the 60s, when the credit squeeze came in, everything stopped in Queensland in building, but you kept going. Why did you keep going? Didn't you? What if you'd failed? He said, I never ever considered failure. One time, Robina and I were walking through a farm that we owned, and we could hear the rustle of the kangaroos jumping through the bush, and we could see the wild orchids, and there were 200 robin redbreasts on a fence. And as we jumped the creek and walked across, I stopped and just looked into her blue eyes and said, sweetie, I'm sorry if sometimes I just get a little hard to live with. And she looked at me and she said, well, you do. She said, but everything will be fine if you just understand one very simple thing. I said, well, tell me, please, tell me, what is it? She said, well, the best way to describe it is I ride horses. She said, just imagine your favorite horse died. Deborah would run and ring up the veterinary surgeon. Peter Jr. would go and get the bulldozer ready to dig a hole, and Graham would get the tractor ready to drag the body in, and the horse would be there, the vet would have come along, and rigor mortis had set in, the blowflies had started to gather, and you'd walk up the track with the cap on the back of your head whistling. And you'd come up to us and we'd say, we're sorry, but your horse is dead. You wouldn't even hear us. You'd have a wall around you. And you'd start talking to that horse. You'd whisper into his ears, and then you'd start to rub his neck. and his back and his legs, and as you persevered with that horse, suddenly the confounded thing would give a grunt. And then before very long he'd get to his feet, and by the end of the day you're riding at bareback, jumping the creeks and the fences and the bales of hay and yelling out, "Yippee! Why don't you understand when something's dead, it's dead?" And I understood clearly what she was saying. She was talking about the number of people that they said were finished and we were able to resurrect them. She was talking about the companies that people said were wiped out and we were able to get them up and make them profitable. She was talking about all the things that people said were finished and couldn't be done, and we were able to somehow move ahead and get it done. I said, "Well, sweetie, there's a man called Edison." Now, Robina doesn't read the kind of books I read, but she meets an awful lot of famous people. She said, "Well, I haven't met him," and I didn't like to tell her he was dead. I said, and Edison said, "Genius has 90% perspiration and 10% ability." She said, "Well, I've never met him, but with you it's 99.9% persistence." That night we were in bed, and as is the case most nights, I always read before I go to sleep. And I had the Reader's Digest, and I just wanted to read it before I went to sleep. And I opened up, and there was a life story of Edison. And I gave her a belt in the ribs. I said, "Hey, he did say 99.9% persistence." Benjamin Disraeli said, "Perseverance and tact are the two great qualities most valuable for all mankind who want to amount to something, but especially for those who want to step out of a crowd." Persistence, ladies and gentlemen, is the need of the hour. But many of you have worries, and these worries choke you and they pull you down and they crush you. They stop you from being the kind of person that you want to be. I learned how to handle worry. I felt as though if I could define it like any other problem, I could handle it. And worry is creating mental pictures of the things you do not want. And I found when I created mental pictures of the things I do want, I could handle the worry situation. I said to W. Clement Stone one night in Birmingham, Alabama, I said, "Mr. Stone, how is it that you, above all people, were able in your lifetime to build an empire?" "Oh, Peter," he said, "we were able to grow so large because we had so many wonderful problems." You see, problems develop character. Problems test your ethics. Problems help you resolve. I know you had Norman Vincent Peale here, and he may have told you this story. As he was walking down the streets of New York, he ran into someone, and they said to him, "Norm, you've got to help me with all these problems." And he said, "Surely you don't want me to get rid of all your problems." He said, "Norman, if you can help me with my problems and to get rid of all of them, you'll be my friend for life." And Norman said to him, "It just so happens that on official duty, I have just been with 150,000 people who have no problems at all." He said, "Norm, take me to them." He said, "The local cemetery." And he went on to say the problems are a sign of life, and the more problems you've got, the more life you've got. And if you haven't got any problems, get down alongside your bed, put your hands up to heaven and say, "God, don't you trust me anymore? Give me some problems." Harvard Business Review said one time, "We sit around and discuss things without facts. We should break ourselves of that." And so often in problems, we sit around and mull over the things rather than get the facts. In my next talk this morning, I'll be talking about how to handle a major crisis. The 13th point is decision making. Just so often we feel as though if we don't make a decision, we're safe, but we've already decided not to decide. And as I move around the world, I find that there are more tragedies, more lives lost, more money lost, more countries broken, not because of bad decisions, but because of no decisions. I use a very simple method in our business of making decisions. First of all, number one is I isolate conversation to that which only directly relates to an answer. Now, everybody wants to throw in their three penn'orth and philosophize about things and sidetrack, but I isolate conversation to that which only directly relates to an answer. Secondly, I clarify and put on paper the essential components involved in the decision. 3, I remove from the decision essential components that affect 15% of the overall impact of a decision. 4th, I concentrate on the remaining elements. And 5thly, make a decision commitment on the basis of subconscious and conscious response after a time of reflection. Many people feel that they can just jog along in decision making. Let me tell you about a man in Atlanta, Georgia. He has one of the biggest trucking companies of the world. He's got a very coarse American accent. And we said to him one day, you'd have to be the fastest decision maker in the world. And he said in this coarse American accent, he said, you can correct something, but you can't correct nothing. We said, but what if you do make a mistake? He said, oh, I'm right 51% of the time. I'm in front and barked another decision. It's been scientifically proven, ladies and gentlemen, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that successful people make decisions quickly and change them rarely, and unsuccessful people make decisions slowly and change them often. Am I ringing some bells out there again? Let me go through that. Successful people make decisions quickly and change them rarely, and unsuccessful people make decisions slowly and change them often. It would be unfair of me to come here today without giving some hints on selling. I am a salesman by vocation, and I would like to share with you how to be in control of every single conversation. Ladies. I was in a big hall once and I said that women are more security conscious than men. And a lady down the front said, I don't believe that. And she was with her daughter there, and I thought, well, I'm just going to have to prove it. I didn't like to do it in that kind of situation. So I said, Madam, what is your name? She said, Betty. I said, what's your husband's name? She said, Fred. I said, Betty, just imagine that your husband went down the butcher shop to get some sausages. When he comes back, you say to him, Fred, where'd you get those sausages? He said, I got them down at Bill Brown's the butcher's down the corner. Now let's just reverse that role. Betty, you go down the shop to get some sausages. And as soon as you walk in the door, your husband says to her, Betty, where'd you get those sausages? You snap back, why, what's the matter with them? And the girl sitting next to her hit her mother and said, Mum, that's you. You see, we're equal before God, but we're quite different. Women are more intuitive than men. I mean, Rabina drives me crazy. I mean, sometimes she comes up with just a perfect answer to a very complex situation. And I say to her, now, how did you get that decision? What was your major premise? What were your minor premises? How did you form the conclusions that you got to? She said, don't give me that jazz. She said, it just seemed to be the right thing to say. And she was right. But how would you like to be in charge of every single conversation? Let me give you a story, a true story, one you can check up on. Peter Jr., he just had one goal. He wanted to be the greatest salesman in the world. At 17 years of age, he was still going to school. He was in his school uniform and went to a Target store where they sell all kinds of things. And his mother and sister went in the ladies' department, and he didn't want to go there, so he wandered around in the tools and the hardware and the garden section. And he looked down and he saw a timber stepping stone. They get the trunks of tree and cut them off in about 3 inches and put them in gardens as stepping stone. He looked at that and an idea was formed. He said to the man behind the counter, he said, do you sell many of those? He said, no. He said, do you know anyone that sells any of those? What was he doing? He was asking the questions. And the young man said, well, there's a company called Lascaux Nursery, which is a big garden company. They sell a large quantity of them. He said goodbye to his mother and sister, hopped on his bike, went home. Fortunately, his voice had broken. He cleared it, rang up the managing director of the company and said, Mr. Lascaux, I understand, sir, you sell a large quantity of natural timber paving slabs. He said, yes, that's right. He said, well, my name is Peter Daniels Jr., sir, and I would like to compete for the business. What was he doing? He was asking the questions, and he was controlling the conversation. He said, oh, Mr. Daniels, ring back on Thursday. We have a buyer's meeting, and I'll see what we can do. So Peter came home from school, left his bike in the drive, ran in, got on the phone, cleared his throat, got down in his best deep voice and said, Mr. Lascaux, it's Peter Daniels Jr. here. I'm wondering if I could have that order, but we will only accept an order in minimum orders of 100. He said, oh, that's fine, Mr. Daniels. He said, we have already decided to give you an order because Peter had given him an attractive price. He said, we will have 100. And Peter thought, wacko. And suddenly he said, for each of our stores. And Peter had this gigantic order that he had to fulfill. He'd never used a chainsaw. He didn't know how he was going to deliver. He was still going to school. But we had a farm at that time, and there was one paddock called the bush paddock with a lot of timber. And he said, Dad, how much will you pay me to clear the bush paddock in the farm? Well, let's bring it right down to earth. He made more money and cornered the total business in South Australia for natural timber paving slabs while he was still going to school, and made more money than anyone else in our church other than his father, and gave more money away than anyone else in our church other than his father. I was speaking last night to some people here, and at the table, different ones were asking me, what are the key elements of success? And I told them I wouldn't tell them because they really didn't want to know. They said they did, and I gave it from the platform later. And you're not going to want to know. You really are not. You want to know some fancy theoretical method of doing it. But Peter Jr. at 19 years of age, when he came in the real estate business as the second youngest person to qualify, said to me, "Dad, I just want to work with you. You just seem to have so much fun." He said, "But I want to have a look at your checkbook." I said, "You can look at my checkbook as much as you like." I said, "But why would you want to look at my checkbook?" He said, "Because I believe that your success is tied to your giving program." He said, "And I want to put you on notice that I'm going to be the Elisha taking the mantle from Elijah, and I'm going to get the double portion of the blessing, and I'm going to outgive you." Last November, he outgave me. And ladies and gentlemen, Luke 6:38 says, "Give and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, as you give it out to others, so it'll be given unto you." And this church has a building program. I just wonder how many of you, I haven't been asked to say this, but I just wonder how many of you, wait for it, are prepared to borrow to give. You want to put yourself under a bit of pressure? You want to succeed? Remember the willingness to bear pain. I've done that. Graham, when he was 13 years of age, in his first short pants, he said, "Dad, I want some money." I said, "Well, it's very easy. Here you can have all the money you want. All you got to do is work for it." You see, we never gave our kids regular pocket money. Sure, we gave them gifts from time to time, but if they wanted money, they could have all the money they wanted. All they had to do was work for it. They haven't got a lazy bone in their body. And he got a job in a department store on Saturday morning and Friday night and over Christmas in his first long pants. He got put in the most inspiring department that you could get put in, selling socks and underpants. He came home the first day, he had a face as long as a butter churn. I said, "Graham, what's the matter?" He said, "Everyone says the same thing." It was high. I said, "What'd they say?" They said, "Can I help you?" I said, "What does the customer say?" "No, thank you, just looking." I said, "Well, son, you got to think of a phrase that will help you to do what you're being paid to do. That is to sell." I said, "If you can't do it within 2 weeks, let me know and Dad'll help you." The next week he came home from work, and he just kicked the door open. He walked in, he said, "Someone asked me how I went today." We said, "Graham, how did you go today?" He said, "I sold underpants and socks as if they were going out of business." We said, "What did you say?" He said, "I went up to them and I said, 'Have you found what you're looking for?' He said, if they said yes, I'd say, 'Let me wrap it up.' He said, if they said no, he said, I'd get them by the elbow and say, 'Let me help you find it.'" Is there any wonder at 22 years of age, he went to a company that has corporate jets and talked them into giving him a corporate jet at no charge with a pilot and filled up with fuel, flew it around Australia, sold it out in piecemeal and let it out to Shell Oil at 22. Had $186,000 in the bank at 22 and everything paid for. Then he lost $630,000 in 1 hour through fraud of someone else, and he just turned to his little wife. He said, "Leanne, we're going to be poor for a while. Don't get used to it. It's not going to last long." You've got to learn to ask the questions and you'll be in control of every single conversation. But sooner or later someone's going to come to you and ask you the question. And how are you going to handle that? You're going to look at them with a smile like 1,000 neon lights and you're going to say, "That's very interesting. And why did you ask that question?" The final thing before we break off, and it would not be right of me not to mention this. God has given you a great power gift. It is so powerful that most of you neglect it. It's the most powerful thing that God has ever given you. It was there in the beginning in the Garden of Eden. It's right with you today. It's being neglected. It's being abused. Many of you, it's been forgotten. It's called the power of choice. Or you can walk out of here and say, "Well, look, that guy from Australia, he just talked a lot of hot air and I couldn't understand his accent anyhow." Or you can say that maybe he makes a bit of sense. He's not getting paid to come over here. I don't need another aeroplane flight. Our last visit here, I spent 48 hours in Toowoomba in Queensland, 24 hours in Melbourne, 48 hours in Kuala Lumpur, 24 hours in Singapore, 5 days in Seoul, Korea, 48 hours in San Francisco, 48 hours in Denver, 24 hours in Chicago, 24 hours in Houston, 24 hours in Dallas, 24 hours in Orange County, 24 hours in Fresno, 24 hours in Los Angeles, 24 hours in Greensboro, North Carolina, 5 days in Orange County, 2 days in Honolulu and home. So I don't need another airplane flight. I've come here to try and stimulate you. You can ignore everything I've said, or you can say, I'm going to change. I'm going to accept the power of choice. Well, I know that you can walk out on your wife or your husband or your children or your job. You can walk out of this church and forget it, or you can make a decision today to change your life. That's a power gift that God has given you. He says, never robotize the mind of man. And in that decision, you can start to develop empires in your brains. I'd like to just wind up with one little poem that I wrote. I just got up at 2 o'clock one morning and wrote this on the back of a cereal packet. And it's called Life is Not a Dress Rehearsal. And it says, life is not a dress rehearsal in a kaleidoscope parade. It is time and guts and thinking. It is honor, love and praise. Or life is not a dress rehearsal that fools and jesters crave. It is helping, serving, winning. It is paths to better ways. Life is not a dress rehearsal. It is opportunity and chance. It is maker of the man regardless of circumstance. Or life is not a dress rehearsal. Every day is opening night. It is now the time to reach that goal. It is now the time to fight. Or life is not a dress rehearsal, so keep your stars in sight. It is God's good gift to all of you. It's for you to keep it right. Life is not a dress rehearsal, so take care and make this sure. It's time to throw away excuses, props and pain. It's time to show them what you are, not what they think you ain't. Life is not a dress rehearsal. It is success within your grasp. It is your destiny you're dealing with, and the sands of time move fast. Or life is not a dress rehearsal. Never compromise the thought. It is overcoming. Keep on running. Your dreams are now in sight, and it's at the mountaintop you'll find the performance of your life. May God expand your life until your destiny is fulfilled.